I thought he'd chase me. He just stopped running. That line kept repeating in my head, even though it wasn't about me. It was about her. Funny how a single glance could make a person feel both invisible and completely exposed at the same time. I had been leaning against the counter at Finch and Sons repair shop, pretending to busy myself with the stack of forms in front of me, though really I was counting the seconds until she walked in. She always came at odd times, as if the universe knew exactly when to throw me off balance. Mid-afternoon, usually, when the sunlight slanted through the dusty windows just right, highlighting the stray specks of paint on the floor. I noticed her before she noticed me. Tall, hair pulled back in a careless twist, sleeves rolled up to show pale, deliberate wrists. There was a confidence in the way she carried herself, not loud or performative, but deliberate, as if she knew exactly where she belonged even if nobody else did. She scanned the room with the faintest quirk of an eyebrow, and then, inevitably, her eyes landed on me. "Hey," she said, voice calm measured. Not a question, not a demand, just an acknowledgement. I nodded, muttering something that sounded like a greeting, but probably came out awkward. My hands were shaking slightly, though I tried to pretend I was just balancing the clipboard. She leaned over the counter to pick up a piece of paper I hadn't realized she'd needed. Her fingers brushed mine for the briefest fraction of a second. It wasn't electric in the obvious way, it wasn't fireworks or dramatic sparks, but it was a charge nonetheless. A static, quiet pull that made my chest tighten. I dropped the pen I hadn't even been holding correctly, and she smiled, just slightly, like she'd noticed but didn't want to make a scene of it. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice hitched in my throat. I could hear her humming softly to herself as she turned back to the shelves behind the counter. A careless tune, maybe from a radio I hadn't realized was on, and yet it felt intimate. The kind of sound that makes a space feel like it belongs to just two people, even if others are in the room. There was a pause, long enough for me to notice the way the sunlight caught the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. A moment too long for anyone normal to stand silently without fidgeting. But she didn't. She just leaned against the counter, waiting, patient, watching, as if she could see right through the clutter of my nerves. And I realized then that this was how she always was. Always poised, always deliberate, even when nothing was happening at all. "Thanks," I finally managed, my voice cracking slightly, as I handed her the paper. She accepted it without looking up, but her fingers lingered a second longer on mine this time. Just a touch, a whisper of connection. I blinked, and she was gone, gliding through the doorway with that easy grace, leaving a faint trace of her perfume, something woodsy, maybe cedar, with a hint of something floral. I sank back into the chair behind the counter, trying to make sense of the fluttering in my chest. Part of me wanted to laugh at myself for overthinking a handshake, a glance, a brush of skin. Part of me wanted to run after her, shout something I hadn't yet figured out, confess some mix of curiosity and longing that had no words yet. Instead, I sat there, heart thudding, pretending to file forms. And I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd stopped just long enough for our hands to meet. The way she didn't chase, didn't need to. And somewhere deep inside, I realized I was already following. Not with my feet, but with my mind, tracing her path, wondering when, or if, she would notice me at all. It was the kind of late afternoon where the sun dipped low enough to turn everything golden, but left shadows long enough to make corners feel private. She was crouched by the corner workbench, frowning at a stubborn cabinet hinge she'd been trying to fix herself. I hesitated for a second, watching her struggle, and then stepped closer. "Need a hand?" I asked, trying to sound casual. My voice caught a little, though I hoped she wouldn't notice. She looked up, eyes narrowing just slightly, as if deciding whether I was trustworthy enough to cross this invisible boundary. "Maybe," she said finally, voice low, careful. Not an invitation, not a refusal, just maybe. I knelt beside her, careful not to crowd her space. Her hands were steady but roughened at the knuckles, the kind of hands that spoke of years of doing things herself. I noticed the way her nails were short and practical, a pale smudge of grease at the edge of one fingertip. Tiny details, insignificant to anyone else, but I couldn't look away. "Here." I said softly, showing her the screwdriver she'd dropped a moment ago. Our fingers brushed briefly again, this time longer. I caught the faint tremor in her hand, and for a second I thought she might pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled sharply, a small sound that was half frustration, half exhaustion. "You do this kind of thing a lot?" she asked, voice quieter now, more personal, almost vulnerable. "Sometimes," I said, shrugging. "Not as often as you, though." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. And then, the briefest laugh, soft and uneven, escaped her. It startled me. It wasn't forced or loud, just human, and it was enough to make my chest tighten. I noticed the faint crease between her brows as she caught herself laughing, like she was apologizing to the world for a moment of joy. We worked in silence for a few minutes, side by side. Every small sound, the clink of tools, the rustle of her sleeves, the quiet hum of the heater, seemed magnified. I kept stealing glances at her, noticing the way her shoulders sloped just slightly, how the gold in her hair caught the light at the right angle. She was composed, confident, but not impervious. Not entirely. Finally, the hinge gave way with a reluctant click. She straightened, brushing her hands on her jeans, and met my eyes. There was a pause, a space of hesitation I couldn't name, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe we had crossed some unspoken line just by being close enough to notice the other's rhythm. She gave me a small nod, half gratitude, half something else, something fragile, hovering at the edge of what she would allow herself to feel. I smiled, almost imperceptibly, and she looked away, busying herself with a cloth, hiding the quick exhale she didn't realize she'd let out. As she turned to gather the tools, her gaze flicked to me again, just for a moment. And in that instant, I felt the slow pull of something forbidden, something dangerous in its gentleness. It was the kind of tension that made your skin feel alive and your heart slightly reckless. She walked toward the door, and I noticed the faint sag in her shoulders as if she'd been carrying more than she'd admitted. I wanted to reach out, to say something that might ease it, but all I did was watch. And I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had laughed, just once, and how that single, tiny sound had a gravity all its own. The rain started slow, a whisper at first, and then turned into a steady drumming against the windows of the small hotel cafe where we'd ended up. I hadn't planned to be here, and I certainly hadn't planned to sit across from her. The warm glow of a single lamp casting shadows that made her look both familiar and unknowable at the same time. She stirred her coffee slowly, eyes downcast, tracing the rim of the cup with her finger. I wanted to say something, anything, to fill the silence that had settled between us like fog. But I didn't. I just watched her, noticing the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together when she exhaled. "You ever feel like," she started, then stopped, shaking her head slightly. "Like you're pretending, even when you're not?" Her question hung in the air, unfinished, like a thread dangling from a sweater. I wanted to answer honestly, to tell her yes, that every day felt like tiptoeing through my own hesitation. But I held it back. Instead, I nodded, letting the silence answer for me. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, catching the curve of her jaw and the faint furrow in her brow. She flinched, and I instinctively reached across the table, just enough to cover her hand with mine. She didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. That half-step, half-touch, half-trust was enough to make my pulse spike. We were quiet for a long moment, and I realized I could count every heartbeat, every subtle shift in her breathing. It was almost intimate, almost a confession, almost the kind of closeness I wasn't supposed to have with anyone. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, stiffened, and muttered something I didn't hear. It was a call from him, or maybe someone else, someone who reminded her of boundaries she didn't want to cross. She didn't answer, just tucked the phone face down, exhaling with a tension that said more than words ever could. I wanted to speak, to ask if she was okay, but the words felt clumsy, too heavy for the fragile space we'd created. So I stayed silent, my thumb brushing hers ever so slightly. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it burned in a way I couldn't ignore. She looked up finally, eyes meeting mine. Her gaze was steady, guarded, but something flickered in the corners, hesitation, curiosity, maybe even the faintest acknowledgement of the pull between us. I leaned in, just a fraction closer, feeling the warmth radiate from her hands through mine. And then, just as I was about to say something, a confession, a question, a hint at what I couldn't stop feeling, she shifted, straightened her shoulders, and glanced toward the door. Someone had arrived, breaking the fragile, electric stillness. My half-formed words died in my throat. She smiled faintly at me, polite, normal, and I let go of her hand, watching as the tension retreated into shadows. My chest felt hollow, tight, and full all at once. I wanted to reach out again, to close the distance that had opened between us in that brief heartbeat. But I didn't. I just sat there, feeling the echo of what almost happened, knowing I'd be thinking about it long after the rain stopped. The apartment smelled faintly of rain and old wood, a quiet heaviness hanging in the air. She sat cross-legged on the sofa, the blanket draped loosely over her shoulders, eyes fixed on some spot on the floor I couldn't see. I stayed by the window, hands tucked into my pockets, pretending to check the weather but really watching her. For the first time, the weight between us didn't feel like possibility. It felt like something pressing down, something inevitable that we had been skirting around for weeks. My chest tightened, and I realized I couldn't keep pretending either. You ever wonder what we're doing? Her voice broke the silence. Low, uncertain, but deliberate. I froze, caught off guard by the rawness in her tone. I swallowed, searching for the right words. I think about it more than I probably should, I admitted, my own voice sounding strange even to me. She lifted her head, eyes locking with mine. There was no guard there this time, no practiced distance, just a bare vulnerability I wasn't used to seeing. Because I do, she said softly, almost a whisper. And I don't know if it's healthy, or fair, or even possible. The words lingered between us, suspended like dust motes in the golden light of the late afternoon. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but even the smallest movement felt like crossing an invisible line. Instead, I just stayed where I was, letting the quiet stretch long enough to feel every heartbeat, every hesitation. I feel like we're doing something we shouldn't, she continued, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the blanket. And I can't stop noticing you. I can't stop thinking about you. But it's all wrong in ways I can't fix. Her confession wasn't about romance, exactly. It was about the fracture of expectation, the slow erosion of the safe boundaries we had clung to. And yet, hearing her say it made the air between us hum with something undeniable. I'm scared, I said finally, because I couldn't hide it anymore. I don't know what this is, but I feel it too. Every time you're near, I feel it. And I don't know how to stop. She didn't respond at once. Instead, she shifted, curling slightly inward, as if protecting herself from some invisible storm. Her eyes glistened, and I realized she had been holding back tears, trying to convince herself she was stronger than she felt. We stayed like that, the room heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, the quiet stretching so long that it became almost painful. And then she looked up, a single breath shaking in her chest, and said something that made the air itself crack. I don't know if I can do this, and I don't know if I can let go. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a surrender. It was just her being real, raw, vulnerable, standing on the edge of a choice neither of us was ready to name. And somehow, that was enough to make my own restraint crumble, even as I stayed frozen, caught between fear, longing, and the unbearable gravity of her words. I hadn't expected her to dig into the old box tucked under the coffee table. It was small, worn at the edges, and looked like it had been forgotten for years. She pulled it out slowly, almost reverently, as if it contained something fragile that might shatter in her hands. I don't usually look at this stuff, she said, voice tight, almost defensive. But she did, sliding the lid open and revealing a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a few photographs curling at the corners. I knelt beside her, careful not to crowd her space. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up a photograph, a younger version of her, laughing with someone whose presence seemed to fill the frame entirely. She held it for a long moment, eyes softening, lips pressed together. He was important, she admitted quietly, almost to herself. Not that anyone else would understand. I wasn't ready for him to leave, and I never really got over it. Her voice cracked, just a little, betraying the calm she usually carried like armor. I didn't know what to say. There was a weight in the room now, heavier than the rain tapping on the window behind us. Instead, I reached out gently, resting my hand near hers on the edge of the box, letting her know, without words, that I was there. She glanced at me, startled for a second, and then nodded slightly. It wasn't fair, losing him the way I did. I pretended I was fine, and I convinced everyone else, but I wasn't. Not really. Her honesty hit me harder than I expected. I realized I'd been holding my own breath for the last few minutes, waiting for her to retract, to shield herself again. But she didn't. She stayed, raw and unguarded. I remembered something, a small detail from a story she had told me weeks ago, about a man she had loved who vanished without explanation. I couldn't resist, even though it felt dangerous. I understand a little, I said softly. I mean, losing someone like that, it doesn't leave you quietly. Her eyes met mine again, wide, as if my words had struck a chord she hadn't expected me to reach. She swallowed, lips quivering. It never really leaves you. And sometimes I wonder if I'll let myself feel anything again without fearing it will end the same way. I wanted to tell her that she wasn't alone, that the past didn't have to dictate this, that there could be a space for something new. But I didn't. I just stayed there, watching the faint tremor of her hand, the way she held the photograph almost protectively, the way her shoulders sagged under a weight I hadn't fully realized she carried. She finally set the photograph down, sighing, a sound that seemed to carry decades of sorrow. Then, quietly, almost as if admitting it to herself, she said, "Sometimes I think I shouldn't even try." And yet, her fingers brushed the edge of mine, almost by accident, almost deliberate. "I still notice you, even now." It was soft, tentative, and yet it shook something deep in me, something I couldn't name, something I didn't want to. I wanted to reach out, to close the space between us, but instead I stayed still, letting the moment linger, a seismic shift in quiet motion. The evening had settled into a soft gray, the kind of light that didn't demand attention but made everything feel more intimate than it should. We were in her apartment again, the quiet hum of the heater filling the spaces between us. Neither of us spoke at first. Words felt unnecessary, almost heavy in a way that might break the fragile balance we'd built. I sat on the edge of the couch, careful not to crowd her, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. She was kneeling on the floor, sorting through a stack of books she hadn't touched in months. Our proximity was accidental and deliberate at the same time. I could see the small crease forming at the corner of her eyes as she concentrated, and I felt something stir inside me, a recognition, a surrender. You don't have to fix everything," I said softly, not a question, more an observation. She glanced up at me, eyes warm but cautious. "I know," she replied, voice low, steady, but not without hesitation. "I just want to try." I nodded, letting the words sit between us. There was no drama, no sweeping confession, only acknowledgement, quiet, human, earned. I realized that the truth had been here all along, hiding in the pauses, in the shared glances, in the lingering touches that we hadn't admitted aloud. Slowly, she moved closer, perching on the edge of the couch beside me, her hand brushing mine in the process. Neither of us pulled away. My fingers traced the back of her hand almost unconsciously, a gentle, careful motion, and she let me, her thumb finding mine in a quiet, unspoken agreement. We sat like that for a long time, the room holding us in a shared space that was ours alone. The rain outside had stopped, but the city was still damp and hushed, and it felt like the world had narrowed down to the small radius of light around us. "You make everything complicated," she said finally, voice just above a whisper, eyes looking past me at some point on the wall, not quite meeting mine. I laughed softly, the sound low and intimate. "I think We do it to ourselves, I admitted. But maybe that's okay. Her gaze flicked to mine then, and something shifted, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but irrevocably. It was in the small acceptance of our vulnerability, the shared breathing, the recognition that this, whatever it was between us, had grown too big to ignore. I shifted slightly, and she leaned just enough for her forehead to brush against mine, a tentative, careful gesture. It wasn't about passion or urgency. It was about presence, closeness, acknowledgement. I could feel her exhale, a soft sigh that carried both relief and uncertainty, and I mirrored it without thinking. We stayed that way, hands intertwined, foreheads touching, sharing the quiet weight of unspoken words. No promises were made, no declarations. Just a slow, steady understanding that neither of us would pretend to be apart anymore. And in that silence, soft, tender, irreversible, I realized that whatever this was, it didn't need a name. It didn't need perfection. It simply existed, earned and fragile, yet undeniable. I let my head rest a fraction closer, feeling her warmth, letting the stillness settle over us like a promise we didn't have to speak aloud. I'm sitting at the same cafe we'd discovered that rainy afternoon, coffee in hand, notebook open but largely ignored. It's been months since that night in her apartment, months since the quiet surrender that didn't need a name. And yet, thinking back, I realized that everything changed the moment we allowed ourselves to just exist together, unguarded. I used to think love had to be fireworks or perfection, grand gestures, clear rules, a script that never faltered. But with her, it was entirely different. It was in the small things, a shared silence that didn't feel empty, a brush of hands that said everything words could not, a glance that lingered a fraction too long. It was subtle, flawed, and entirely human. She changed too, though in ways I only notice in hindsight. The guarded tension that once softened her edges has thinned, just a little, enough for me to see the real weight she carries beneath her confident exterior. I've seen her pause to laugh freely, to allow herself moments of joy without guilt. She moves through her days differently now, lighter in ways she wouldn't have admitted back then. And I've learned patience, the quiet power of noticing the small currents that pull two people together. I've learned that desire doesn't always demand action, that restraint can be its own kind of intimacy. I've learned to be present, truly present, even when the world is loud or messy or indifferent. We're not perfect. There are still moments of hesitation, of fear, of wondering if this fragile thing between us will survive the ordinary challenges of life. But it doesn't feel fragile anymore, not in the same way. It feels earned. It feels possible. And maybe that's enough. I remember the rain against the window, the weight of her hand in mine, the way our foreheads touched in silent understanding. Those moments weren't grand, weren't cinematic, and yet they've become the foundation of everything I understand about love now. It doesn't have to roar to exist. Sometimes it simply waits, patient, quiet, inevitable. I glance at the street outside, watching the sunlight catch on puddles. I think about how far we've come, how much was risked in silence, how much was learned in small gestures, in the pauses between words. And I realize the story isn't over, not in the traditional sense, but it has reached a point of understanding that feels whole. So I take a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and I smile, quietly, to myself. It's a soft ending, a gentle afterglow of everything we didn't say aloud but felt in the marrow of our bones. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?